Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history. Today we move into a new unit on the Carolingians. We previously covered the victory of Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, which halted the Islamic invasion of France. Charles Martel was descended from the son of Saint Arnulf of Metz and the daughter of Pepin I of Landen. Because of his achievements, the Carolingian dynasty was named for him, for Charles Martel. The family of Carl, or in Latin, Carolus. Even though Charles never claimed the title of Rex for himself, and this is analogous to the Merovingians, named for their ancestor Merovec, even though he likewise never claimed the title of Rex, or king. In keeping with the practices of feudalism, which we covered in the unit on St. Bede, after his victory at the Battle of Tours and his subsequent acquisition of Aquitaine, Septimania, and Provence, that's southern France, Martel began a two-step process. First, endowing the church with fiefs from the conquered territories. Fiefs are units of land. Second, rewarding his loyal followers with these endowed monasteries, convents, and dioceses. The ranking prelate at the time in the Regnum Francorum, the kingdom of the Franks, was St. Boniface, to whom an earlier unit was devoted. Boniface and the papacy were aware of the feudalism problem in general, and Charles's actions after the Battle of Tours in particular. This de facto subordination of church to state was part of the price, frankly, that the church had to pay in order to stay alive after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And it remained a bane for the church throughout the medieval period. And when I refer in the course to the feudalism problem, that's what I mean. It's not just one problem. It's the system of feudalism in which the church and the secular authorities consistently used or misused the church for economic and political gain. Of course, the church gets blamed for that. Even though we had zero way to stop that. We have, yet, of course, the church is political. And at the same time, though, it was possible for the church to make use of secular objectives and at times help advance them in return for secular support in achieving ecclesiastical goals. And this brings us to the conversion of the Netherlands and Germany, which, for reasons to be explained, coincided with the incorporation of those regions into the Regnum Francorum, the kingdom of the Franks, beginning under the Merovingians, whom we've already covered, and solidified by their successors, the Carolingians. The story involves coordination from the papacy using Anglo-Saxon missionaries from England, missionary monks, and Ireland, spanning territory on today's maps from the Netherlands to Austria, from Utrecht to Salzburg. So that's in air miles. It's 583 air miles. If one were to get on a plane in Utrecht and fly to Salzburg, Austria, that's how long. Of course, walking it, with rivers and mountains is much more. So now we're gonna orient ourselves before we move on. Okay. Now, actually, I'll do this one first. Okay, now from my perspective, this all, it looks backwards. So let's see if the light, okay. So this is present-day France, and the Netherlands is Italy down here, Spain down here. So to orient ourselves, okay, well, Utrecht's not even on this map. Okay, so much for that. All right, so that's not going to work. But all is not lost. Okay. All right, here's the Netherlands. This is today's maps. Okay, so here's the Netherlands and Belgium. So the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Germany, and okay, and this Luxembourg. We're going to spend some time here too. So it's hard to see on this map, but right here is Utrecht and the Netherlands. So I'm going to be talking about Utrecht, so just keep this in mind, Utrecht and the Netherlands. And so to connect that with what we covered previously, what we're going to cover today, here's in Luxembourg, this is Echternach, which I'm gonna talk about that in a minute. Okay, now a different map. Okay. All right, so this is a different map. It encompasses more territory, and the trade-off is it's not as detailed. So in the Netherlands up here, Utrecht isn't actually on this map because but here is where it would be, and we're going to go all the way down to Austria, and that's Salzburg. All right, so we're covering this from the Netherlands down to Salzburg, Austria. 583 air miles, but a lot longer to walk. All right. Okay. All right. That's for now. That'll do. So we began in the year 734. That is 2 years after Martel's victory at the Battle of Tours. In that year, 734, St. Boniface appointed St. Withbert as abbot of Hersfeld, and that is north of Fulda, Germany. Okay, no, there's Germany. I can't find it. Okay, so here's Germany. All right, it's hard to see on this map, but see between the E and the R, you see a place called Fritzlar. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then south of that is Fulda. Oh, this print is so small. It's right here. It's Fulda. Fulda's right there. So between the E and the R, Fritzlar and Fulda. And then while I have this out, so you see down here, we're gonna a couple other places we're gonna mention is Regensburg, right here. Regensburg. And this is in southern Germany is Bavaria and Swabia. So to save time, I won't pull all this out every time I mention a place. So just keep those in mind. Okay. So at Herzfeld is 27 miles north of Fulda. So the Herzfeld is the one between the E and the R on the map. Okay. So who's this guy now? He's an Anglo-Saxon. So they spell their names in an odd way, and so if you look it up, sometimes those spellings are not retained. So Saint Withbert is it's spelled in the Anglo-Saxon Wihtberht, but that's been contracted, and in the contracted spelling, it's spelled Wigbert, Wigbert. So like St. Boniface, this Withbert was born in England, though in a different place. He was born in Wessex, instead of where Boniface was, who was born in Essex. Moreover, like Boniface, Withbert joined other Anglo-Saxon missionaries traveling to the continent to bring the gospel to the pagans. Now, nothing just happens. So this appointment in 734, it sounds, okay, St. Boniface appoints a guy as head of a monastery. All right, that sounds pretty routine. In an ecclesiastical life, it is. But this one appointment was the culmination of a generation of labor by both church and state, taking us back 54 years earlier. And this is all entwined in the story of the Carolingians. And without the Carolingians, the medieval church would not have developed in the way that it did. And so you'll see this close entwining of church and state, with both positive and negative, results. But that's just what happened. So and so you see how that developed. So taking it back to understand this appointment in 734, Pepin of Heristal, who was Charles Martel's father, is serving as mayor of the palace for the Kingdom of Austrasia. Coveted the town of Dorestad in the Netherlands, in territory controlled by the pagan Phrygians. Why? Well, Dorestad was a nexus of trade, and therefore a source of money, information, and power. Its proximity to a fork on the Rhine River gave travelers to it access to Germany via another river, the Niederrhein, which is the northernmost branch of the Rhine River, or access to the southern Netherlands and northern France via the Lech River, or access to the northern Netherlands and further north via the Kram Rin, which is the crooked Rhine because of the way it bends like a bent elbow at that point. The Phrygian chieftain at the time was a guy named Radbod, R-A-D-B-O-D. So Radbod naturally was rather attached to Dorestad, and as it was valuable, he was not disposed to just give it up because Pepin wanted it. Pepin, therefore, organized an invasion and offered to endow the church with lands from any of the conquered territory if missionaries accompanied the expedition and set up monasteries as religious basis of operations in order to convert the Phrygians from paganism. In 689, Pepin of Heristal defeated Radbod at the Battle of Dorestad, adding the region between the Schecht River and the Vlie River to the Regnum Francorum. I won't go, but it's just the Netherlands. In other words, it is so the Carolingian base, home base, well, the Franks, the Merovingians, their base was Belgium, and they moved south into France. So now, essentially, Pepin of Heristal is just moving them north into the Netherlands. Pepin's invitation to missionaries was accepted by Saint Willibrord, not Willibald. Willibald is a different saint. Willibrord is spelled Willibrbd. And he is recognized as the apostle of the Phrygians in the Netherlands. Another one, ethnically Saxon, born in Northumbria, northern England. He was given to the church as a child by his family, the Abbey of Ripon in Yorkshire in northern England. That's at the convergence of two tributaries of a river, the River Ore. This giving a child to the monastery was a characteristic practice of feudalism, as we've seen, which had mixed results. But in the case of Willibrord, he embraced his monastic vocation, and in so doing, made substantial contributions to church history. Willibrord spent the years from the age of 20 to 32 at a different abbey in Ireland. This abbey was established for Anglo-Saxon vocations. I know that doesn't sound right because this was such a long history of antagonism between the Irish, who are completely different culture that's ethnically Celt, different language, different history, and the Anglo-Saxons, which is very different. But so this abbey in Ireland was the Abbey of Rothe-Melcigi. So to explain, we know from the unit on St. Bede that the clergy of the time were aware of the feudalism problem. As we have the description of it from Bede. It's a letter he wrote to one of his students. And I read you an excerpt of that in that unit. And they were aware that many young men and women were simply sent into ecclesiastical life by their families without a genuine vocation. And the church was unable to stop it at this point. Remember, this is not a free society. So the church had to adapt. So this abbey of Rothe-Melcigi was one example of how the church adapted. This was a place for young men that they would all be, like, no one just joined that abbey. They were sent from another abbey. Whatever abbey a young man was originally deposited by this family. If the abbot at that original abbey observed that as the young man grew that he was embracing the monastic vocation and was sincere, then that abbot would send him to this abbey of Rothe-Melcigi for essentially advanced training in monastic discipline. And Willibrord was sent from Ripon by his abbot to this abbey. So it's like an elite advanced training to be a monk, a real one. In the year 690, after this was done, St. Willibrord and 11 companions, you see 12 total, 12 apostles, they accepted the offer of Pepin of Heristal and journeyed across the Channel, journeyed to Phrygia, the Netherlands. Meanwhile, fighting continued in the Netherlands, as Radbod was not reconciled to his earlier defeat or to the presence of Franks on his lands. So you see that here we have the ethnic hatred again. The Franks were ethnically German, the Phrygians were not, so they, of course, they hate each other. After 2 more years of fighting, in which Radbod was consistently defeated, Radbod lost Utrecht to Pepin. Utrecht is 17.9 miles north of Dorestad. So not only did Pepin get Dorestad, which is what this was all about, that trade nexus, but also got a buffer zone further north. And I showed you where Utrecht was already on the map, so I won't pull that out again. Today, Utrecht is the 4th largest city in the Netherlands. During the Roman period, during the Empire, the legions followed the crooked Rhine, the aforementioned, the Kram Rhin, which is a distributary of the real Rhine River. And they used it as part of the Limes Germanicus, the border, the German border. Now, that's the Netherlands. It's not Germany, but that's just what they called it. To guard it, the Romans constructed a castello, a fort, at the point where the Kram Rhin forks into 2 other rivers, the River Vecht to the north and the River Leeds Rhin to the west. They called this castello, this fort, the Ultra Triectum, which means the farthest 3 rivers crossing, meaning the farthest from Rome. So like the northernmost, at least by that point, the northernmost point at which there was a possibility of accessing 3 rivers. And so this Triectum was a castrum, a fortress, to guard it. It is noteworthy in understanding how the medieval church operated that St. Willibrord made the very long journey to Rome, where he was ordained a bishop and received the pallium from Pope number 84, Pope St. Sergius I. He received it in a ceremony on the 21st of November, 695. This established Willibrord as canonically legitimate in the apostolic succession, as bishop of Phrygia. And as bishop, he had the fullness of holy orders, so he was empowered to confirm converts, not just baptize, but also confirm. And he was empowered to ordain new priests. With this authority, Willibrord returned to Phrygia, to the Netherlands, and established a diocese at Ultra Triectum, at Utrecht. And even though that's where the name Utrecht comes from, Ultra Triectum, that Utrecht, that's, and he's still the patron saint. Willibrord is still the patron saint of Utrecht. 3 years later, in the year 698, Pepin of Heristal's mother-in-law, his name was Ermina, donated to Willibrord an old Roman villa stolen from the Imperials after the empire fell. Willibrord converted it into the Abbey of Echternach. That's Echternach. A town grew around it, so it formed the nucleus of the town of Echternach, which is the oldest town in Luxembourg. I don't want to do all that again. I lost have it on a different page. Luxembourg, and it's the oldest town in Luxembourg that still exists. It is near the 107-mile-long River Sauer, S-A-U-E-R, which is now the border between Belgium and Luxembourg. It is a left tributary of the Moselle River in France. Time passed. In the year 711, St. Willibrord presided over a marriage intended to seal an alliance between the formerly hostile Phrygians and the Franks. Pepin of Heristal gave his son Grimold to the daughter of Radbod. Now, her name was Theadsvind, and Grimold. Aligning this with previous material, this is the same year that Islam invaded Spain, Visigoth Spain. The peace sealed by this marriage lasted 3 years, which for the 8th century was a pretty long time. It lasted until Pepin of Heristal died in 714, at which point Radbod took the opportunity of a dispute between Pepin's sons to retake the lands he lost in Phrygia, to retake Utrecht and Dorestad. He devoted particular ferocity against the clergy, whom he regarded as not only servants of his political enemies, but also as spiritual aggressors against his gods. Remember, he's still pagan. Churches, convents, abbeys were burned. Any male ecclesiastics captured, priests or monks, were murdered. Any nuns who were captured were kept alive for reasons that require no explanation. Here is an account from the period. We always try to take the time on its own terms, describing how this was understood by the faithful at the time. So this is from a life, a vita about St. Boniface, which was written by a relative of his. It was written by his, his mother's, no, Boniface's nephew, by his nephew. So from the Vita, beginning at section 4, quote, "But a fierce quarrel that broke out between Charles," this is Charles Martel, "the prince and noble leader of the Franks, and Radbod, the king of the Phrygians, as a result of a hostile incursion by the pagans, caused great disturbances among the population of both sides. And through the dispersion of the priests and the persecution of Radbod, the greater part of the Christian churches, which previously had been subject to Frankish control, were laid waste and brought to ruin. Moreover, the pagan shrines were rebuilt, and what is worse, the worship of idols was restored. When the man of God," this is Boniface, "when the man of God perceived the wicked perversity of Radbod, came into Utrecht, and, after waiting for a few days, spoke with the king, who had also gone there, and having traveled about the country and examined many parts of it to discover what possibility there might be of preaching the gospel in the future, he decided that if at any time he could see his way to approach the people, he would minister to them the word of God. On this purpose of his glorious martyrdom, many years later, set its seal. A strange thing in the sanctity of the saints is that when they perceive that their labors are frustrated for a time and bear no spiritual fruit, they betake themselves to other places where the results are more palatable. For there is nothing to be gained if one stays in a place without reaping a harvest of souls. With this in mind, when the saint had spent the whole of the summer in the country of the Phrygians to no purpose, and the autumn was nearing its end, he forsook the pastures that lay parched through lack of heavenly and fruitful dew, and, taking several companions with him for the journey, he departed to his native land. There, in the seclusion of his monastery, he spent 2 winters and 1 summer with the brethren, who received him with open arms. In this manner he fulfilled that passage in the writing of the Apostle to the Gentiles, that's St. Paul, where it says, "For I have decided to spend the winter here." That's a reference to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12. Meanwhile, St. Willibrord escaped the Netherlands. He escaped to safety in Frankish territory. There he met a diverted, which this I just read you from the life of Boniface. So there he met Boniface, who was an Anglo-Saxon missionary like him, but at the time Boniface was still named. He had his original name Winfrid. We've already met him. And Winfrid had intended, he was on the way to join Willibrord's mission. And then he walks into this war. So they met in France. When Boniface realized it was not possible to go to Phrygia, he journeyed to Rome, with results we've already covered. The name change to Boniface, and his ordination as a bishop, a missionary bishop to Germany, by Pope 89, Pope St. Gregory II. Meanwhile, Charles Martel emerged victorious in the power struggle following his father's death against his siblings to make himself mayor of the Palace of Austrasia. And remember, that's the eastern part of the Regnum Francorum, with the capital at Metz, M-E-T-Z. Martel was then free to punish Radbod, which he did, by invading Phrygia and killing Radbod in battle in 719. St. Willibrord and his surviving missionaries were then able to return to Phrygia, serving Utrecht in the Netherlands and Echternach in Luxembourg, until Willibrord died at his post at Echternach on the 7th of November, 739, at the age of 81. Willibrord was buried in Echternach. He is still honored as the patron saint of Luxembourg, one of the patron saints of the Netherlands. He's also a patron saint of epilepsy and epileptics. His feast day is November 7th. This is how Willibrord was regarded in the medieval period. In the words of a fellow scholar monk from England, but from a different part, this one was from Northumbria, and this is the scholar monk Alcuin of York, about whom we'll have much to say when we get to Charlemagne. Alcuin, among the many things he wrote, Alcuin wrote a biography of Ito, a life of Willibrord. And here is an excerpt. This one is from section 1, quote, "There was in the island of Britain, in the province of Northumbria, a certain householder of Saxon descent, whose name was Wilgus, living a devout Christian life together with his wife and family. Skipping down to section 3. Quote, when her time was come, the woman bore a son, and at his baptism his father gave him the name Willibrord. As soon as the child had reached the age of reason, which is the age of 7, his father gave him to the church at Ripon, to be instructed by the brethren there in religious pursuits and sacred learning, so that living in a place where he could see nothing but what was virtuous, and hear nothing but what was holy, at his tender age, should be strengthened by sound training and discipline. From his earliest years, divine grace enabled him to grow in intelligence and in strength of character, at least as far as was possible at such an age, so that it seemed as if in our day there had been born another Samuel, of whom it was said the boy grew up and advanced in favor, both with God and with men. Skipping down next to section 4. Quote, when this youth, as highly endowed with sacred learning as he was with self-control and integrity, reached the 20th year of his age, he felt an urge to pursue a more rigorous mode of life, and was stirred with a desire to travel abroad. And because he had heard that schools and learning flourished in Ireland, he was encouraged further by what he was told of the manner of life adopted there by certain holy men, particularly by the blessed Bishop Egbert, to whom was given the title Saint, and by Withbert, whom we met, but it's when we met him, it's in the future, so now we're meeting Withbert earlier in his life. The venerable servant and priest of God, both of whom, for love of Christ, forsook home, fatherland, and family, and retired to Ireland, where, cut off from the world, though close to God, they lived as solitaries, enjoying the blessings of heavenly contemplation. The blessed youth wished to imitate the godly life of these men, and, after obtaining the consent of his abbot and brethren, hastened quickly across the sea to join the intimate circle of the said fathers, so that, by contact with them, he might attain the same degree of holiness and possess the same virtues, much as a bee takes honey from the flowers and stores it up in a honeycomb. There, among these masters, eminent both for sanctity and sacred learning, he who was one day to preach to many peoples was trained for 12 years, until he reached the mature age of manhood and the full age of Christ. Accordingly, in the 33rd year of his age, the fervor of his faith had reached such an intensity that he considered it of little value to labor at his own sanctification unless he could preach the gospel to others and bring some benefit to them. He had heard that in the northern regions of the world the harvest was great, but the laborers were few. So he embarked on a ship, taking with him 11 others who shared his enthusiasm for the faith. Some of these afterward gained the martyr's crown through their constancy in preaching the gospel. Others were later to become bishops, and after their labors in the holy work of preaching, have since gone to their rest in peace. So the man of God, accompanied by his brethren, as we have already said, set sail, and after a successful crossing, they moored their ships at the mouth of the Rhine. Then, after they had taken some refreshment, they set out for the castle of Utrecht, which lies on the bank of the river, where some years afterwards, when by divine favor the faith had increased, Willibrord placed the seat of his bishopric. But as the Phrygian people, among whom the fort was situated, and Radbod their king, still defiled themselves by pagan practices, the man of God thought it wiser to set out for Francia, and visit Pepin, the king of that country. Now he wasn't Rex. Technically, he was not Rex. As we saw as mayor of the palace, he was exercising actual power, but they still were doing this in the name of puppet Merovingian kings. But still, a man of immense energy, successful in war, and of high moral character. Skipping down to section 13. It came about, however, that Pepin died, and his son Charles, this is Martel, became head of the realm. Charles brought many nations under the power of the Franks, and among these were the Phrygians, whose lands were added to his domains after the defeat of Radbod. At that time, St. Willibrord was officially appointed to preach to the Phrygian people, and his episcopal see was fixed at the fortress of Utrecht. Being given greater scope for the preaching of the gospel, he now attempted to bring into the church by baptism the people that had recently been won by the sword. He allowed no error or past ignorance to pass unnoticed, and lost no time in shedding upon them the light of the gospel. Skipping down, number 23. He baptized Pepin, the short hair, son of the valiant Charles Martel. And this Pepin, the short hair, we've alluded to previously. He is going to become, he's the one who's going to end the Merovingian dynasty and make himself king of the Regnum Francorum and start the Carolingian dynasty. So this is Pepin the short hair, son of Charles Martel. So he was actually baptized as a child by St. Willibrord. On the 6th of November, that is the 8th day before the Ides, Willibrord passed from this place of pilgrimage to the eternal country, and was buried in the monastery of Echternach, which, as we have said before, he had built to the glory of God. So that was Willibrord's biography, as it was written in the medieval period. It contains many of the stories of interest, but these suffice to establish how he was understood, his centrality in the conversion of the Phrygians, as well as his importance as a spiritual father to other missionary monks who carried on his work into Germany. Specifically, two who were alluded to, St. Boniface and St. Withbert were both mentioned, as well as another one who's on the way. He wasn't mentioned by Alcuin, but he's on the way. This is St. Sturm, S-T-U-R-M. In the year 723, 4 years after the death of Radbod, St. Boniface took the mission into Germany, traveling 213 miles northeast, brought him to Fritzlar in northern Hesse. I showed you that on the map. That is on the north bank of the Eder River. The Eder is 110 miles long. It converges with the river Fulda, and that river, as well as a settlement on it that's going to be named for the river, Fulda, is going to enter our story later. I also showed you where that was. There, at Fritzlar, Boniface discovered, actually, since this is, so Fritzlar, it's here, between the E and the R. See right there, that's Fritzlar in Germany. And then Fulda's further south. Fulda's right there. Fritzlar, Fulda. And here's the Netherlands up here. So Utrecht is off the map. So he would have, traveled all the way, down there. It's 213 miles. It doesn't look it on that map, but he's following the rivers. That's how he gets there. Sometimes, well, not there. There wouldn't have been, but further on the western side of the Rhine and the southern side of the Danube, when they traveled, they could follow the old Roman roads, which were still there, but not there. They wouldn't have been Roman roads there. So then they have to follow the rivers. There at Fritzlar, he discovered the Germanic, they were called, the Romans called them the Cati, and then that became, as the consonants drift, that the Cati, that got shorted to the Hati, and then the Hati become the Hesse, and then that becomes the Hessians. So Hesse, that's where they get the term Hesse from. Anyway, he found the Cati. They were Germanic, ethnically Germanic, religiously pagan. They were conducting pagan rites in a grove around a tree called Donar's Oak. Trees were sacred in Germanic paganism, owing to their belief in Yggdrasil, which was, in their mythology, was an ash tree, actually not an oak. It was believed to be the center of the cosmos, connecting all the worlds, so they all like hung off branches of this tree. What happened next is recorded. It was recorded in the medieval period, and it entered into medieval Catholic consciousness as a treasured story of the faith. So this is from the Vita of Boniface, written by Willibald, not Willibrord, Willibald, at section 6, quote, "Now many of the Hessians, who at that time had acknowledged the Catholic faith, were confirmed by the grace of the Holy Spirit and received the laying on of hands." So that's confirmation, which Boniface could do at this point, because you remember he had been ordained a bishop in Rome. But others, not yet strong in the Spirit, refused to accept the pure teachings of the Church. Moreover, some continued secretly, others openly, to offer sacrifices to trees and to springs, to inspect the entrails of victims. Some practiced divination, legerdemain, incantations. Some turned their attention to auguries, auspices, and others sacrificial rites. That's hematomancy, blood magic, which could include human sacrifice. Sometimes it was animals, but it could also include humans. While others, of a more reasonable character, forsook all the profane practices of the Gentiles and committed none of these crimes. With the counsel and the advice of the latter persons, Boniface, in their presence, attempted to cut down, at a place called Geismar, which is now Fritzlar, that's what I showed you, a certain oak of extraordinary size, called in the old tongue of the pagans the Oak of Jupiter. Taking his courage in his hands, for a great crowd of pagans stood by watching, bitterly cursing in their hearts the enemy of their gods, he cut the first notch. But when he had made a superficial cut, suddenly the oak's vast bulk, shaken by a mighty blast of wind from above, crashed to the ground, shivering its topmost branches into fragments as it fell. As if by the express will of God, for the brethren present had done nothing to cause it, the oak burst asunder into 4 parts, each part having a trunk of equal length. At the sight of this extraordinary spectacle, the heathens, who had been cursing, ceased to revile, and began, on the contrary, to believe and to bless the Lord. Thereupon the holy Bishop Boniface took counsel with the brethren, built an oratory from the timber of the oak, and dedicated it to St. Peter the Apostle. He then set on a journey to Thuringia, which I'll talk about shortly. Thus, he built 2 churches, one in Fritzlar, which he dedicated to St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles. The other was in Ammenburch, which he dedicated to St. Michael, the Archangel. He attached 2 small monasteries to these 2 churches, and invited a large number of monks to serve God there, with the result that even to this day, praise and blessing and thanksgiving are offered to the Lord, our God. When all these arrangements had received their final completion, he set out on a journey to Bavaria, where Hugobert was then duke. Okay, the text mentions Fritzlar and Thuringia. The following year, 724, St. Boniface established a monastery at Fritzlar, and he appointed St. Withbert as founding abbot. We met St. Withbert in the life of St. Willibrord. As abbot of the elite monastery, as abbot of the Anglo-Saxon monastery in Ireland at Rath Melcigi, designed to train those of proven sincerity of vocation. Boniface intended Withbert to do the same in Fritzlar, Germany, to recruit those with genuine vocations to monastic life and prepare them for the task at hand, which was to use monasticism as a methodology for religious propagation and conversion. Meanwhile, Boniface himself journeyed about 100 miles east of Fritzlar into Thuringia. Thuringia is an area. It's in central Germany, where he established another monastery under the patronage of St. Michael, and that was at Ohrdruf. 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 That was in 726. 8 years later, in 734, 2 years after Charles Martel's victory at the Battle of Tours against Islam, we catch up to the introduction to this talk, where St. Boniface assigned this same Withbert, he transferred him to establish a monastery between Fritzlar and Ohrdruf, this time at Hersfeld, which is in Hesse. That is 33.9 miles southeast of Fritzlar, 62.1 miles west of Ohrdruf, at the convergence of three rivers, the Geisa, the Haune, and the Fulda. Among those recruited by St. Withbert and trained at this abbey at Hersfeld was St. Sturm, S-T-U-R-M. St. Sturm would later be the founding abbot of an abbey in Fulda, Germany. And we'll talk about him when we get to that in the chronology. Meanwhile, in the following year, 735, Charles Martel, still in his capacity as mayor of the palace, still serving the figurehead Merovingian king, and this for the moment, it was King Theuderic IV. Martel, in his name, conquered the kingdom of Burgundy, which we've already visited in previous episodes. That corresponded to eastern and southern France, plus present-day Switzerland. Once more, joining that kingdom to the Regnum Francorum, to the kingdom of the Franks. With this victory, Martel had reunited all the Frankish realms and added to them others that he had conquered. That's West Phrygia, that's Friedland in the Netherlands, Hesse in Germany, Thuringia in Germany, Alemannia in Germany, and Swabia. Well, Swabia was part of Alemannia, what was called Alemannia then, and Bavaria. So central and southern Germany, essentially. In the same year, 735, attempting to seal the Frankish conquest in Germany, another marriage took place. And this is also, keep in mind, this is more evidence of the feudalism problem. Since this is a course for the, church history for the seminarians, I kind of focus on the damage it did to priesthood, but it did equal damage to marriage. Like, the purpose of marriage is not to do this, is not to form alliances, among these other, for the purpose of acquiring land. That's a distortion. That's an abuse of the sacrament of matrimony. Just as when the families send their kids into the church just so they can use the fiefs of the church's endowment for the benefit of the family. So, feudalism did equal harm to both sacraments of vocation. Anyway, this is what they did. So, in 735, Martel married his son, Pepin the Shorthair, to a German princess from the Danube, from southern Germany. Her name was Lutberga. Or Lutberga. Sometimes the G is. They had 5 children. Connecting this with previous material, at least chronologically, in the same year, 735, St. John Damascene was ordained a priest at his monastery in the Holy Land. And in that same year, St. Bede the Venerable died. So Bede died, John Damascene ordained, Pepin the Shorthair, who's going to become the first Carolingian king, got married. All happened that same year, 735. 2 years later, in 737, St. Boniface transferred St. Withbert again, transferred him to Thuringia to serve as abbot of St. Michael's in Ordruff. St. Withbert died at his post a decade later. He is still the patron saint of the town of Hersfeld. His feast day is August 13th. The St. Boniface, the reason that Boniface transferred Withbert in 737 was because Boniface himself was planned to go to Rome again. This would be his 3rd visit to Rome, to consult with the Pope. This is Pope number 90, St. Gregory III. Perceiving advantage for the Church's missionary enterprise through Charles Martel's conquest in Germany, Pope Gregory appointed St. Boniface as papal legate. A papal legate is not part of the sacrament of holy orders. Boniface was already a bishop, so he had the fullness of holy orders. Papal legate was an administrative position which empowered Boniface to establish new dioceses where justified by circumstances of conversion. As a bishop, he could ordain new men. He could establish monasteries for men, convents for women. He could establish parishes. But he could not just on his own establish, dioceses wherever he wanted. But as a papal legate, he could. He was specifically empowered to do that. And he used it, used the authority to create the dioceses of Passau, Salzburg, Regensburg, Freising, and and Mainz. But Mainz he made the metropolitan see, like the archdiocese of the mission, of the German mission. 5 years into his legation, his time as papal legate, bringing us to the year 742. A disciple, one of his disciples, one of his spiritual sons, founded another monastery, according to the rule of Saint Benedict. And remember, in the section on Boniface, he always used the rule of Saint Benedict for these monasteries. So this new disciple I've alluded to earlier, Saint Sturm, S-T-U-R-M. Sturm established the abbey at, priory first, but it became an abbey, monastery, at Fulda, F-U-L-D-A. So who is this guy? Saint Sturm is the first of these guys in the missions that we meet who was actually born in Germany. Present-day Austria, but he was born ethnically he was German. He grew up speaking German. Where he was born around 705 A.D. On old imperial maps in the empire, it was Lauriacum. That was on the Istrian limes, the Danube River now. The Romans called it the Ister, River. And that was one of the limes, that was one of the borders of the empire. And Lauriacum, present-day Lorch in Austria, Lorch, is at the point where the river ends, ENNS, meets the river Danube. So the Romans, like they put up a castrum there, a castellum, a fortress, a castle, to guard it at the intersection of the two rivers. And so it was called Lauriacum, and that's, even though the empire was gone, because, you don't have to be a Roman to understand the significance of the intersection of two rivers, and there was already an infrastructure there, so, the Germans just moved in. And Sturm was born there 3 centuries after the empire fell. Sturm met and became a spiritual son of St. Boniface in the year 739, when Boniface was organizing a new diocese of Salzburg in Austria. I don't know, did I show you that on the map? Salzburg. This is the Salzburg where Mozart was later born. Yeah. So here's Austria, and Salzburg is up in the north. Okay. Don't tell anybody about this. Okay. It's only because it's late at night. It's not because I'm getting old. Anyway, yeah, there it is. Salzburg. Right there. So here's Switzerland, Austria. There's Salzburg. And Vienna. Vienna's over here. If you want to orient yourself. This did not happen. Right. So when Boniface was creating that new diocese of Salzburg, the Sturm, Lauriacum, is just down the Ister. From there, that's where he met him, and Boniface was impressed with it, with the sincerity, and sent him for monastic formation under Saint Withbert. And Sturm, through his travels, through Boniface's network, became acquainted with Fritzlar, Hersfeld, and Ohrdruf. 3 years later, only 3 years later, in 742, Boniface entrusted Sturm with the task of establishing a new Benedictine foundation, initially a priory, 26.4 miles south of Hersfeld, on the Fulda River. I mention this, it's kind of building up to it, because of all the ones mentioned, apart from Utrecht, which is in the Netherlands, but of all the foundations he did in Germany, Fulda is the place that Boniface designated as the place he wanted to be buried. Of all the places he founded, Regensburg and all that, he wanted to be buried in Fulda. Now we're fortunate in having a detailed account of how the site was chosen, and this account, it's one of these snapshot things. It tells us so much. It tells us about monastic formation, how these guys were trained, the mechanics of how they went about, just the practicalities of how they went about. You founded Herzfeld, you founded Fritzlar, but nothing just happened. So there's a lot of background to this, and this is one account we happen to have that gives us that insight. So this is from another Vita. This is the life of Saint Sturm, written by Igil, who was a later abbot of Fulda. So this is, he's writing it for his own monks, but it's written in the medieval period in the 9th century. Quote, this is just an excerpt. At the time the venerable Archbishop Boniface set foot in Norica, That's present-day Austria. Imparting the faith to the priest and the people, suppressing their errors, curbing with the true doctrine of Christ those people who, although already Christian, were infected with the evil teaching of the pagans. Certain nobles came to him vying with each other to offer their sons to be brought up in the service of God. Among those whom he accepted was Sturm, a native of Norica and a member of a noble Christian family. Leaving behind all his relatives and following the Father of our redemption, he set out joyfully on a journey with the bishop who had accepted him, much to the grief of his father and mother. After they had traversed several provinces, they reached Fritzlar in the land of the Hessians, where the bishop entrusted him to the care of a certain priest named Withbert. This holy priest took great pains to instruct the boy Sturm in the service of God. And now you seminarians, listen to this. This is what instruction meant for them in the 8th century. Continuing the quote. After he had learned the Psalms by heart and mastered many books by repeatedly going over them in his mind, the boy began to understand the spiritual meaning of the Scriptures and set himself to learn the hidden secrets of the 4 Gospels of Christ, and, as far as he was able, to fix in his mind by continual reading the Old and New Testaments. His meditation was upon the law of God, as Scripture says, night and day. His understanding was profound, his thoughts full of wisdom, his words prudence. Pleasant in countenance, modest in bearing, good-mannered, irreproachable in conduct, charitable, humble, mild, ready to perform any service. He drew to himself everyone's affection. After a certain length of time, he was, with common consent, ordained priest. And, as opportunity presented itself, he began to explain to the people the hidden words of Christ. When he had spent almost 3 years of his priesthood preaching and baptizing, he was divinely inspired to undertake the rigorous life of a hermit. This idea haunted him at every moment of the day, until, on a divine impulse, he opened his heart to his spiritual master, the Archbishop Boniface. Okay, the life is very long, so I'll just say Sturm became a hermit for a period of time, and then had to relocate because of the proximity of hostile Saxons who were pagan. It's further north from where he was. So now, returning to the quote. Thereupon, Blessed Sturm meekly accepted the suggestion of the Archbishop, and being anxious to discover another site, set out eagerly for a hermitage. Then he took 2 brethren with him, and set off, upstream in a boat. As they glided along the river Fulda, they kept a sharp lookout for streams and fountains. They then disembarked and traversed the country on all sides, looking at the soil, the mountains, the hills, the heights, and the valleys, to see if the Lord would show them a place in the wilderness fit for them to live. Okay, we'll pause there. So what is this? They're looking for a water source. It's something to drink. But they're also looking at the soil. Because remember, all these monasteries are self-sustaining. You can't go to the grocery because, this is barbarian land. So can they grow food? Or can they grow crops? Or can they raise animals? Is there enough grazing where they could breed animals? Is there fishing? There has to be something. So that's the practicalities of what they're looking for to make a self-sustaining. That's the whole reason that these using the monasteries as a vector for missionary work is that they would be self-sustaining, so they could be a basis of operation. It was once you have that, then they could go out and do work for a while, then come back and replenish and resupply, and then go back out. Okay, back to the quote. On the whole, they thought that the Archbishop might not approve of it, meaning the site they were looking at. Then, sailing back along the same river, the River Fulda, after a short time they arrived at their own poor huts. There they continued to pray to God to find them a suitable site for a hermitage, where they might be able to serve him in accordance with the requirements of the Archbishop Boniface. Day and night they persevered in fasting, watching, and prayer. Then the holy Bishop Boniface, mindful of his hermit Sturm, and pleased at what he had done to find another site, sent for him and asked him to come quickly to his presence. On the second day, after he had set out, he met him in the place we have already mentioned, called Fritzlar. When it was told to the bishop that the hermit Sturm had arrived, he gave orders that he should be brought into his presence forthwith. When he had eaten and the table was removed, the bishop rose, took him aside into a quiet place where they could be alone. And there they talked for a long time about spiritual matters and about the Christian life. For, as afterwards appeared, the bishop was very eager to establish monastic life in the wilderness. And for this reason, he inquired, among other things, what had transpired in the hermit's search for a site. Sturm answered, "We traveled upstream along the River Fulda for several days, but we found no place which we could recommend to you." The holy bishop understood from this that the place preordained by God had not yet been revealed. Okay, we pause again. I'll summarize. There's a lot of description. Boniface then sent Sturm back to Herzfeld for spiritual restoration. Then Sturm resumed his search to one place, then another place, and so it's like a test of fortitude. But just to skipping down now, we continue the quote. Then he turned back a short distance and came to the blessed spot foreordained by God, on which the present monastery is built. At the sight of it, Sturm was filled with great joy, and continued his journey in high spirits, for he was convinced that through the merits and prayers of St. Boniface, the place had been revealed to him by God. As he walked over the ground and saw all the advantages the place possessed, he gave thanks to God, and the more he looked at it from every angle, the more pleased with it he became. So charmed was he with the beauty of the spot that he spent practically a whole day wandering over it, exploring its possibilities. Finally, he blessed it and turned his face toward home. After 2 days' journey, the man of God arrived at Herzfeld, where he found his brethren engaged in prayer. He told them of the new site and ordered them to set out with him at once. Without further delay, he asked the prayers of the brethren for himself and set off to see the bishop. The journey took several days, but when he came into his presence and was kindly received by him, he began to describe the place he had found and to enlarge upon its advantages. "I think," he said, "that I have found a site of which you will approve." And when he had acquainted him with the lie of the land, the fertility of the soil, and the supply of running water, which satisfies the needs of the monastery even to the present time, and this is written 100 years later, but still in the medieval period, the bishop was filled with enthusiasm. Both of them congratulated each other and gave thanks to God. And then they embarked on a long discussion on the monastic life and its observances. For a few days the bishop entertained the hermit in his house, and after some pleasant talks together, he took pains to speak to him on spiritual matters, stimulated him to a love of monastic life by examples taken from sacred scriptures. And so, instructed and confirmed by sound doctrine and the teaching of Holy Writ, Sturm was allowed by the bishop to return to his cell. Boniface, on his part, set out for the king's court to seek confirmation for the appropriation of the land for the monastery. Okay, so here's another part. So we saw the practicalities, got a monastery that can physically survive and support itself, but then here we have the entwining of the church and state. So Boniface is very careful not to do this, not to lay claim to land without, talking to the authorities in the state. Now, this is Germany. This is not the Regnum Francorum officially, but the Franks, because of Charles Martel's conquest, this is conquered territory. So he's going anyway. He's going back to the kingdom of the Franks. Now this guy says he went to talk to the king because by that point the Carolingians were kings. By the time this was written, but at the time that Sturm founded the site and Boniface went to ask for it, they were not yet kings. They were mayors of the palace. So functionally, the de facto power, but not the de jure kings. So back to the quote. St. Boniface, as we have mentioned, went to Carloman. And again, he calls him king, but he's not. This is the son of Charles Martel, who was functioning as mayor of the palace of Austrasia. That's the Eastern Frankish kingdom. And addressed him with these wise and humble words. I believe that it would redound to your everlasting reward if, God willing, and with your help, monastic life could be established and a monastery could be founded in the eastern part of your kingdom, a thing that has not been attempted before our time. For this reason I beg your kind help in this project, so that in future and forever a never-fading reward may be laid up for you before Christ, the High King. We have found a site suitable for monastic life in the wilderness, which is called, this is near the river Fulda. But this property belongs to you. I now beg your Highness to give us this place, so that under your protection we may serve Christ. On hearing these words, the king was glad and called together the nobles of his court. He spoke to them with approbation of the bishop's request, and in their presence handed over to him the property for which he had asked. The place you seek, and which, as you say, is called Igil, on the banks of the river Fulda, and any other property I am supposed to possess there at this date, is granted whole and entire to God. And all the land that lies north, south, east, and west of that point, for a distance of 4 miles, shall be included. A charter of this gift was ordered to be drawn up, signed by the king's own hand, and all the nobles in the vicinity were summoned by messengers and asked to follow the king's example, if by any chance they possessed any property in that quarter. On the day appointed, when they I'm going to skip this. Skipping down. Okay, the donation was accordingly confirmed by all, and passed through to the possession. Passed from the possession of men into the possession of God. Blessed Sturm departed to his brethren at Drylar, which is what they were calling their hermitage, and after a few days took 7 of the brethren with him to the spot where the monastery now stands. On the 12th day of January, in the year of the Incarnation 744, during the reign of the two brothers, Carloman and Pepin, those are the sons of Charles Martel, the brethren set foot for the first time on this holy spot, preordained for this purpose by God. They prayed to the Lord to watch over and protect it at all times by his invincible power. And then, seeing him day and night in fasting, watching, and prayer, they set to work, as far as they were able, to cut down the trees and to clear the site with their own hands. At the end of 2 months, the venerable Archbishop Boniface, accompanied by a great throng of men, came to see them, and, after inspecting all the ground and being made aware of all its advantages and usefulness, he rejoiced in the Holy Ghost and gave thanks to God for having granted to his servants so suitable a place. The bishop and the monks then agreed that a church should be built, and so he ordered all the men who had accompanied him to cut down the woods and clear the undergrowth, whilst he himself climbed the brow of a hill which is now called Mons Episcopi, the bishop's hill, the bishop's mountain, and spent his time praying to God and meditating on sacred scripture. After a week of felling trees and clearing away the brushwood, the turf was piled up ready to make lime. Then the bishop gave the brethren his blessing, commended the place to God, and returned home with the workmen he had brought with him. The following year, the bishop came again to visit his new monastery, which by that name was called Fulda, taking its name from the river which flows close by, and after greeting them, remained with them for several days, during which time he gave the newly recruited monks instruction and established the observances of monastic life according to the principles laid down in the holy rule of blessed Saint Benedict. This account of the establishment of Fulda from the life of Saint Sturm introduces us, as was mentioned in there, to the sons of Charles Martel, Carloman and Pepin the Short. And I mentioned earlier that refers to his hair. So he kept his hair short, that made an impression on people because the Merovingians who were running things they were the long-haired Franks. So Pepin was setting a trend. So who are these guys? So Charles Martel's first wife was named Rotrude. She was from eastern Belgium. She was actually an aunt of St. Chrodegang, who we met in a previous session, through her sister, Landrada. Charles Martel and Rotrude had 5 children. Their daughter, named Landrada, died young. Another daughter, Auda, became Countess of Autun through marriage to the Count of Autun. Another daughter named Hiltrude became a duchess when she married Odilo, the Duke of Bavaria, and their 2 sons, who figure more prominently in our story. Carloman was the elder, and Pepin the Shorthair was the younger. After Rotrude, their mother, died in 724, Charles Martel remarried, and he had a child named Griffo, but that guy, he'll briefly enter our story, but he's not as significant. And so we'll pause here, because next we're going to talk about let's talk about Carloman first, who was the eldest son, and then next will be Pepin. And these are the 2 that follow Charles Martel. So for the moment, we'll pause there. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.